people began in slavery within the southern states of America. But I come to let you know that our history began more glorious than what has ever been portrayed. If our history began in slavery, how did we end up in this predicament? If historians stated we were born slaves, who placed us in this bondage? Moreover, if our history began in slavery, were we not worthy enough or destined for a better way of life? We all must understand that the history of the African American people runs deeper than the roaring waters of the Mississippi River or the blazing hot cotton fields of Alabama. It runs across a large ocean where the silent voices of murdered Africans leapt from the cool depths of the crashing water. It runs across 3 continents and various islands where African lives were separated by slave trades and slave auctions in exchange for mere goods. It runs across an arid land of Africa where animals ran wild and free on their native soil, and where our ancestors' freedom was snatched from the grips of their native land. It runs to and through remote areas of the jungle where another world of civilizations hid secluded from the outside world by the jungle trees. It is here where our history began, a life birthed in royalty, full of freedom, ordered by a structured class system and an atmosphere filled with an aromatic aroma of peace and tranquility. It is here where our African ancestors displayed the oldest record of intelligence in technologies such as weaponry, mathematics, chemistry, agriculture, medicine, and aerodynamics. These technological advances help bring attention to how rich African countries were and the power of its inhabitants. However, how long could our ancestors keep foreign invaders from interrupting their peaceful and productive way of life? way of life as our African ancestor had known it would be no more. Their lives would never be the same again. Once captured, Africans were marched along the African coast and then forced onto massive slave ships to various destinations. In the 1700s, a route called the Middle Passage trafficked captive Africans along a triangular route between Africa, America, and Europe. This passage would take weeks, even months, under horrid conditions. Conditions aboard slave ships during the Middle Passage was appalling. Men packed tightly together below deck and secured by leg irons. The space they were assigned was so cramped that it forced them to crouch or lie down for weeks or months at a time. The air in the holding chambers was excessively hot and oppressive, that it became foul and rancid with a lack of proper sanitation. Sickness and disease swept through the chambers, such as fever, dysentery, smallpox, while the lack of food and medical attention increased the death rate tumultuously. Women and children were kept in separate quarters with restricted movement and freedom. They were constantly exposed to violence and sexual abuse from the ship's crew. On these ships, our ancestors were in poor health from the physical and mental abuse they endured from this harsh treatment. They were forced to dance and entertain the crew aboard the ships as if they were sailing further and further from their homeland. Once in America, the African captives that survived the treacherous journey were placed up for sale in the slave trade. Removed from their high places, stripped of their freedom, and marked with the scar of disgrace, our ancestors were forcefully transitioned to the slave trade markets as if they were cattle headed to the slaughter. They stood in slave markets chained, half-beaten, bruised, and traumatized from being in a place foreign to their eyes. The African slave trade was a process of buying, transporting, and selling human beings as slaves for cheap labor. They were sold to buyers to work on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. Auctioneers would bring captured Africans in front of buyers as if they were not human. The interested buyers would inspect the captured Africans for distinct marks or wounds that would prohibit excessive labor. If women were with children or babies, the auctioneer would rip the babies from the mother's arms and leave them to die or be sold separately from their mother. The emotional trauma and the agony of mothers felt as the flesh of their flesh and bones of their bones were devoured in the hands of evil. But what could they say? What could they do but endure and rely on the true source of life?
When I walk through deep waters, I know that you will be with me. In the midst of the fire, I will not be overcome. Through the valley of the shadow, I will not fear. I am not alone. I am not alone. You will go before me. You will never leave me. I am not alone. I am not alone. You will go before me. You will never leave me. In the midst of deep sorrow, I know that you would be with me. In the darkness of the shadow, I will not be overcome. Lord, you fight my every battle. I will not fear. I am not alone. I am not alone. You will go before me. You will never leave me. I am not alone.
plantation, owners sought ways to eliminate our ancestors' identities and memories of their former way of life. Owners wanted to break the African slave's will and any bonds connected to their past. They applied a term called seasoning, which forced Africans to adapt to their new environment, way of life, language, working, and living conditions. This process could take up to 2 or 3 years. The trauma of the voyage and the brutality of the seasoning process caused many of our ancestors to be killed, commit suicide, and be severely punished for trying to escape or resist this inhumane treatment. To justify this brutal treatment and harsh labor system, slave owners would use biblical arguments that masters were superior over their servants, and servants were biblically obligated to obey their masters or be punished. Those that endured found solace in Negro spirituals. Since the beginning of their existence, music has been an important part of African heritage, and it continued throughout their slave experience. Negro spirituals or slave songs help slaves bear their sufferings and rely on a higher source for their strength and their deliverance. Chants and rhythmic beats would help slaves synchronize group tasks to ease the burden of strenuous labor as they worked feverishly day and night. Even in hardships, they would express their spiritual connection to the Lord as they worked in the hot southern sun. It was through this connection slaves were able to endure and press onward to see what the end would be. In their free time, slaves would listen and dance to music performed on string instruments to help wind down after a stressful and treacherous day, blocking out the worries of tomorrow and the idea of repeating the same punishment over and over again. During this time, music was not only used for work and recreation and religious purposes. It was also used as a way to secretly communicate among slaves plans of escape or other forbidden acts. The hardships and mistreatment of slaves were wearing thin. The brutal beatings, the separation of families, the lynchings, and the treacherous and excessive work labor caused the slaves to seek deliverance. When would it all come to an end? When would God send deliverance from their burdens and their oppressors? How long must they go on living in fear and bondage? But little to their own awareness, God was devising a plan for their deliverance. Throughout slavery, he stirred the spirit of heroes and heroines to rise up to bring freedom, justice, and deliverance to our ancestors. Conductor on the Underground Railroad, which was a secret network that helped slaves escape slavery in the South and transition to freedom in the North. She made over 19 trips over this secret route that led to over 300 people being led to freedom. Although slaves made the long journey to the North and were free, the Fugitive Slaves Act of 1850 required the U.S. government to assist slave owners in recapturing the fugitive slaves in the North. Slave owners would send bounty hunters to the North to siege runaway slaves and return them to the South. Many times, they would take African Americans who were legitimately free and place them in slavery. Nat Turner was a black slave who led a slave rebellion in 1831. He was a fiery preacher and leader of African American slaves on Benjamin Turner's plantation and throughout the South, Hampton, Virginia. Nat Turner claimed he was chosen by God to lead slaves from bondage. He believed in spiritual signs and divine voices, that the time had come to rise up and kill their masters, because claiming ownership of another human being and taking someone else's freedom was murder in itself. As a result of this rebellion, 55 white people were murdered. After hiding for 6 weeks, Nat Turner experienced a brutal death. Approximately 200 slaves were murdered, and Southerners, out of fear, instituted harsher laws against slaves. After the rebellion and death of Nat Turner, the few civil rights of slaves and free black people, especially the right to assemble, were restricted. This issue of slavery continued to divide the country as new areas began to apply for statehood. This caused tension between the North and the South because of sectionalism. Sectionalism was one's loyalty to the interest of one's region rather than to the nation as a whole. Citizens of the South had beliefs that centered around slavery, while most North expressed other beliefs. These beliefs would further divide the country and lead to the Civil War. After decades of simmering tensions between northern and southern states over slavery, states' right, westward expansion, and the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, the southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States.
Oh, way down south in the land of traders, rattlesnakes and alligators, right away, come away, right away, where
Later, the Civil War was birthed, leading to the costliest and deadliest war fought on American soil. It ended in 1865 with the Southern Confederate States surrendering to the Union. To assist in the victory over the Confederate States, many free and enslaved African Americans stepped up to fight in the war. The 1st Black Civil War Regiment was the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. This regiment was made up of freed slaves from Florida and South Carolina. The regiment saw very little combat, but was eager to fight for their freedom. The most famous Black Civil War regiment was the 54th Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts was the first African American regiment to recruit in the North and consisted of freed men. The 54th Massachusetts led to the attack against Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor. The capture of this harbor was important to allow the Union warships to enter and besiege the city of Charleston. African American soldiers during the Civil War made great sacrifices for their freedom and a nation that refused to accept them as equal citizens.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, oh, glory.
Since they go against our skins, become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion in us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all, justice specific enough. When sundown, the spirit is revisiting us. True and living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When it goes down, we women and man up. They say stay down, and we stand up. Shots, we on the ground, the camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be Oh, glory. Oh, 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 glory.
Although the war was over and the transition to emancipate slaves was underway, what were free slaves to do? The only way of life majority of slaves knew was bondage and servitude. Since many slaves were prohibited to learn how to read or write, how could they rise above the predicament they were in? Many free slaves were forced back into slavery through the chain gang system and other political ways to keep the Southern way of life progressing and booming. Even though the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery, white Southerners enacted a series of laws known as Black Codes or Jim Crow laws to restrict freed blacks' activity and to ensure a continual slave labor system. So during this time, hatred was at its height, and it was demonstrated by how Southerners expressed this anger.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaf, oh, blood at the root, black bodies swinging
in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here's a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter
Although the war was over and the transition to emancipate slaves was underway, African Americans sought ways to create their own identity. The NAACP was founded in 1909 to promote equal rights, to eradicate racial prejudice amongst citizens, to advance the interests of colored people, and to increase their opportunities in education, employment, and other interests. With the flux of African Americans migrating to the North shortly after World War I, it was during the Harlem Renaissance period that artists and writers sought ways through their work to enhance the self-esteem of African Americans. They accomplished this goal by creating extraordinary works of art and literary showcases that showed their strength, resilience, and intelligence of the African American people. This period helped America try to understand African American culture and how to integrate blacks and whites in society. During the Harlem Renaissance, African American music, its literature and artwork flourished. But with the effects of the Great Depression, many Harlem Renaissance artists and writers began to fade out, and African Americans sought ways to express their desires to be treated equally with respect and dignity. It was during the 1950s that the civil rights era was birthed. It was a time that African Americans sought ways to resist racial prejudice, demand equal rights, and fair treatment of all African Americans. It was during this time resistors rallied for social, legal, political, and cultural changes to discrimination and segregation. Higher powers pressed on the hearts of great leaders to rise up and lead a band of support, not just blacks, but whites, to social and societal changes of racial inequalities. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one prominent civil rights leader during this time. He was a Baptist minister who had extraordinary speaking skills, which gave him the ability to connect and persuade thousands of followers to protest peacefully against the societal injustices of the world. In 1955, he helped lead the nonviolent protest of the Montgomery bus boycott and organized other nonviolent protests.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the
Malcolm X, a leader in the Nation of Islam, was another leader for racial change. His philosophy was different from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X's slogan was, "By any means necessary," which included armed self-defense and violence. He later became a minister and a powerful speaker that Black power was the key. Blacks must rely on themselves to make their lives better.
We have to go to the root. We have to go to the cause. Dealing with the condition itself is not enough. And it is because of our effort toward getting straight to the root that people oftentimes think we are dealing in hate. We are oppressed. We are exploited. We are downtrodden. We are denied not only civil rights, but even human rights. So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy.
The Black Panther Party, also known as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, was an African-American revolutionary party that was founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Their purpose was to patrol the African-American neighborhoods to protect residents from acts of police brutality. They later evolved with the idea of arming all African Americans, the exemption of African Americans from the draft, and reparations, which are payments of compensation to all African Americans for centuries of exploitation by white Americans. The Black Panther Party grew to over 2,000 members and operated in many cities in America. The Black Panthers created many programs to help Black families in their own neighborhoods. Though many activists and leaders rose up to combat the problem of racial injustice and continual segregation, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party left its mark during the Civil Rights era, letting us know we should be Black and proud.
We just want to party just go. We just want the money just go. I want to party just for me. You ain't got to dance, shake the bread. We just want the party just go. We just want the money just go. I want the party just for me. You ain't got to dance, shake the bread.
This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now. People not whipping now. This is America. Say it now. Say it now. One more time. Say it now. I wasn't on job. I needed my hand. You know all the work I did before the other man. And now we're a man of the man. Do things for ourselves. We're tired of beating our head against the wall and working for someone else. Say it now. Say it now. Say it now. Say it
On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And the Black Panther Party was considered the greatest threat in the internal security of the country by J. Edgar Hoover, which led to various raids of their establishments and was later dismembered. With hope fading away in the stillness of each day, whose heart would be stirred to give hope again to the African American people? Who will rise up and take the mantle of leading our people to equality and justice?
Ever since, it's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard a living up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movies and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling my brother, don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will, yeah, yeah. Then I go to my brother, yeah, and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me, yeah, back down on my bending knees. Oh, there were times that I thought I couldn't last for long. Now I thank the Lord that I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Yeah.
Divided to stand together where common hopes and common dreams still live. I stand before you today to announce my candidacy for President of the United States of America.
Barack Obama was born on August 4th, 1961 in Hawaii. He later graduated from Harvard Law School and was elected to the Illinois Senate in 1996, where he served until he became a United States Senator in 2004. He announced his candidacy for the office of United States President on February 10th, 2007. With this announcement, an era of hope swept across African American communities, a feeling of change that was so desperately needed to bring equality and unity to this very nation. Many civil rights leaders placed their trust, support, and confidence that the time of change had come. During one night in November of 2008, the most unimaginable dream came true with the message, yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes,
all things are possible. Who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time? Who still questions the power of our democracy? Tonight is your answer. It's the answer told by lines that stretched around schools and churches in numbers this nation has never seen, by people who waited 3 hours, 4 hours, many for the first time in their lives, because they believed that this time must be different, that their voices could be that difference.
Like a fool, I wouldn't stay too long. Now I'm wondering if your love's still strong. Ooh, baby, here I am, signed, sealed, delivered. I'm yours. Like that time I went and said goodbye. Now I'm back and not ashamed to cry. Ooh, baby, here I am, signed, sealed, delivered. Ooh, I am, baby, yeah. You got my future in your hand, baby, yeah. Now, here I am, baby, yeah. You got my future in your hand, ooh, yeah. I did a lot of foolish things that I really didn't mean, didn't I? Hey, hey, hey. Been around in this old world. Now I know that you're his only girl. Ooh, baby, here I am, signed, sealed, delivered. I'm yours. Ooh, 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 you set his soul on fire. Don't you know that you're his heart's desire? Ooh, baby, here I am, signed, sealed, delivered. I'm yours, here I am, baby, yeah. You got the future in your hand, baby, ooh, yeah. Here I am, baby, yeah. You got the future in your hand, baby, did a lot of foolish things that I really didn't mean, did I? Hey, hey, hey. So here I am, baby, yeah. Got my future in your hand, baby. Come on, help us out, house. Here I am, baby. Yeah. You got my future in your hand, baby. Ooh, yeah. Here I am, baby. Yeah. Signed, sealed, delivered. I'm yours, baby. I'm yours. Now here I am, baby. Yeah. Signed, sealed, delivered. I'm yours. Yeah. Here I am, baby.
We have come this far by faith, and we are pressing forward. We still have work to do and some ways to go, because our innocent young black boys and men are being killed on the streets. We must not forget them or our struggle. Our ancestral journey was necessary. It was necessary for us to see that no matter how long you try to chain us, beat us, or keep us from what is destined, we will rise. We will rise. We will rise.
were destined for something else.
Decided that families needed to be together.
I am who I am today because God used my mistakes. He worked it out for my good, like no one else ever could. I am who I am today because God used my mistakes. He worked it out for my good, like no one else ever could. I am who I am today because God used my mistakes. He worked it out for my good, like no one else ever could. I am who I am today, 'cause it was necessary. It was necessary. It was necessary. It was necessary. It was necessary.
From the arid jungles of Africa, stolen from our homeland, sold into slavery, beaten, raped, mutilated, disgraced, and more. Here we are, resilient, proud, courageous, beautiful, loved, and strong. Here we are. Here we are. Here we are.
Dancers, if they will come up. We have our stage crew. We have our villagers that came with the technologies and advancement of the African people. We have our queens, the royal queens. The ballet dancers. We have our foreign invaders. We have those who played animals in various parts. We have our gentlemen that played the African Guards, the Black Panthers, the slaves. They played the chain gang. And then we have our B-team dancers. We would like to thank our narrator, Mrs. Asia Dickerson. We would like to thank our vocalists. We'd like to thank Valerie Horton Young. We would like to thank our music teacher, which is Mr. Aaron Taylor. We'd like to thank our sound and DJ, Elder Josie from Shallow. We want to thank our community supporters. We want to thank the director. We want to thank Jamelia Gates and Rachel Pierce. We want to thank all the teachers of East Middle School, our principal, Sherry Prater. We want to thank our assistant principals. We want to thank Chandra Slocum and Matt Koval, our community staff. I also want to give a huge thank you and present him with this shirt because Miss Skoda, myself, and Miss Pierce was paying a lot out of our pocket. And I went crying to him, and he gave me money to put this on. Bishop Brock, if you can come forward. He gave us donations to help put this together, as well as other community sponsors, Safe Harbor. This all came about when I was sitting in Abby Nelson's social studies class, and many students began to ask, were we always slaves? And even though the textbook tells you one thing, and it begins to cloud our minds, we want to read beyond the pages. So I began to tap into Abby Nelson. I went to go see Bishop Brock, who is the former professor of Mercyhurst and African Studies. And we began to piece together that we were kings and queens. And if we were kings and queens, shouldn't we act like kings and queens? Shouldn't we do what kings and queens do? Shouldn't we behave like kings and queens do? So it was necessary for our ancestors to go through all the things that they went through so we can be where we are. But wouldn't it be a slap in their face if we don't live up to what they went through? Wouldn't it be a slap in their face if they endured all that suffering, all that pain, all that agony, if we're still going to be ignorant, if we're still not going to take advantage of education, and if we're not going to treat our own brothers and sisters the way we're supposed to be treated? So I wanted to let them know that you are not what society says you are. You're beyond the pages of the book. But if you never read the book, if you never listen to your teachers, if you never read beyond what your teachers say, you will always be what society says. And we need to be what we were and what we are, and that's kings and queens. So I thank you all for coming. I thank you for taking the time. We hope that you enjoyed the show. If you would like to make a donation, we want to take them on a field trip at the end of the year. If you want to make a donation to the 8th grade, please see Mr. Koval on your way out, or you can bring your donation up and we'll take it. We'd be greatly appreciative. But we thank you for your time. Thank you. Drive home safe and have a nice one.